With 10 months left in his term, U.S. President Barack Obama offered wide-ranging and even undiplomatic views on the state of the world this week in an extensive interview in The Atlantic. As his words ripple across the capitals of friend and foe, what does the world make of this Obama Doctrine? For that, we welcome, in Munich, Germany, via Skype, Christian Leuprecht, professor of political science at Royal Military College. In Washington, D.C., Heather Hurlburt, director of the New Models of Policy Change at New America. And also in Washington via Skype, Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute, and we're happy to have all three of you on TVO tonight. I want to start, Heather, with you, and I want to start where that Atlantic piece begins as well, which is the whole issue of Syria, the president drawing a red line, saying that if Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, he would face military consequences. He did, and he didn't. I want to go back to 2.5 years ago when the president decided not to take military consequences against Syria and Assad, and I'm wondering what the Washington foreign policy establishment's reaction was to his kind of walking up to that red line and then stepping back.
Well, you really saw a couple different reactions 2.5 years ago, one of which is, Obama references in the article in some detail, this idea that somehow there's a monolithic Washington establishment obsessed with credibility, I think he says in the piece. And there certainly was a lot of that 2.5 years ago. But what you also saw, frankly, from anyone who had to face the voters or who worked for anyone who had to face the American voters was great relief when he walked back and a feeling that what he did was actually quite in tune with the feelings of the American people on the topic. And that, I think, is a really fascinating subtext of that piece, which may perhaps not be widely appreciated as it's looked at in the rest of the world. Just the extent to which Obama, both in his interest in diplomacy, in his interest in reaching out to parts of the world where maybe the U.S. had been absent for some period of time, and also the intense frustration that comes through that I'm sure we'll get to, really in many ways is quite reflective of where the American public is and where I know global audiences are seeing that channeled also in some less polite manners by other speakers.
Yeah, Hussein, he described it in the Atlantic piece as kind of his day of liberation from the Washington foreign policy establishment and a break with, quote unquote, the Washington playbook. Did you see it that way as well?
Well, I mean, no, I didn't. In fact, what's extraordinary is the self-congratulatory tone of the president's remarks that comes through loud and clear. I mean, you just can't miss it. It's his greatest achievement was of not fulfilling his own sort of threat and promise and vow, towards Assad. And what's remarkable is whether you think that was the right decision or not, and there's a case to be made either way, what you can't call it is courageous, because Heather is exactly right. It was enormously popular, and what would have been unpopular would have been to actually use military force. That would have been very controversial. The public was dead against it. Congress was very strongly against it, and I personally met with 4 different Democratic stalwart members of Congress who were trying to come up with explanations for their constituents about why they might vote to authorize the use of force in this case. In the end, they didn't have to, and I think the whole thing was just enormously politically popular, and as well as preserving the channel to Iran that I think President Obama wanted to do. So, there's a great deal of historical revisionism in his construction of this as a liberatory, triumphant moment of kind of a breakthrough in his own assertion of his coming into his own as commander-in-chief. I think, to the contrary, you can go back and read it as a rather craven moment of political cowardice.
Well, I want to know what they think overseas, across the Atlantic Ocean. And Christian Leuprecht, you are over there in Germany. So I wonder, in your conversations with European foreign policy establishment makers, I wonder what they thought of the Obama quote where he said Europe requires too much American hand-holding. What do they think of that?
Well, I mean, this is a long-time challenge, and some folks in the U.S. like to joke that NATO, for instance, stands for needs Americans to operate. But I think it comes down to different perspectives. That, for instance, in Germany, there's just a profound skepticism of the use or deployment of kinetic force to solve what are fundamentally political challenges. And then, of course, you have colonial legacies in several countries like France and the UK that they are fully aware of, and that these still have bruisings on the ground in many of those countries, and so some apprehension to get involved. Plus, of course, they're much closer to the action. So if something goes pear-shaped, as it did, for instance, in Libya, the Europeans have to live with those consequences in a much more immediate fashion than the Americans, for instance, have to do. And so inherently, I think it comes down to perhaps a difference of perspective, but it also depends on the country. That countries such as Germany and the United Kingdom still orient themselves very much on Washington and the importance of this transatlantic relationship, and always trying to do enough to make sure that they continue to preserve that relationship, while countries such as France show more readiness to go it alone. And Mali and the intervention in Mali, Operation Serval, demonstrated that.
Heather, I want to get a better understanding, since we're going to talk a lot about it over the next half hour, about the so-called Obama Doctrine, which this magazine article goes into great detail on. I know the president has said in the past, and I quote him here, that much of what animates his foreign policy approach is, and again I quote him, "Don't do stupid shit." Could you go beyond that and tell us what your understanding of the Obama Doctrine really is?
So sure, I'll try to summarize a little bit of some of what he lays out at the end of this piece, and that is be keenly focused on American security, but back away from, and I think this is an interesting counterpoint to what Christian said, back away from the idea of needs America to operate, that really challenge allies and partners to take up the complaints that I think the American left has heard very sincerely from Europeans and others for many years about how the U.S. was always doing too much, always the bully. And Obama came into office saying, okay, great, I don't want to be the bully. I want you all to do it yourselves. I don't want to be the heavy hand in the Middle East. So that's a piece of it. Another piece of it that I think he's come to after 7 years in office is focus on areas where you can see immediate prospects for success, and leave areas where you can't see prospects for immediate success a bit behind a cordon. And that, leads you to the sort of Middle East specific piece of the Obama Doctrine, where Obama says, look, we have over-focused on the Middle East for decades now, and that has cost American lives. It's cost American credibility and a sense of American moral force by whom we've chosen to align ourselves with. So he said, let's stop doing that and let's refocus on other areas where we think we can get more done. Now, I do think sort of the last piece of the Obama Doctrine that you have to add now is a little bit of the sort of sadder but wiser. And I think this is where some of the cynicism, which to me was the most surprising aspect of the piece, whether it was making snarky comments about European allies' willingness to pull their weight, which frankly, every American political leader from every party has grumbled about at one time or another, but few have chosen to say in public in quite such a blunt way, or, which I'm sure we'll get to, some of the ways he characterized the Middle East, which were also, frankly, rather blunt and sweeping generalizations that you don't associate with as fine-grained a thinker as Obama, for better and worse, tends to be.
Well, let me pick up on that. Since we're in that region of the world, Hussein, I'll go to you next on this. The Saudis didn't like to hear the president's contention that they are going to, quote-unquote, need to share the region with Iran. So what are the implications of what the president had to say for the future of the Middle East and those two countries in particular?
Oh, well, let me focus first on the Saudis. I mean, the use of the word share was very unfortunate, because what it implies is that Iran and Saudi Arabia, because he was specifically talking about those two countries, have equal footing, equal standing, equal role in a Middle East that's mostly Arab and Sunni rather than Persian and Shiite. Also in which the United States shares almost all the strategic, or rather Saudi Arabia shares almost all the major long-term strategic goals that Washington does, and Iran opposes almost all of them. So that from the Saudi point of view, they would say, well, what's the point of aligning with Washington when at the end of the day, a country that has confronted the United States over the past 30 years continuously, including using terrorism, and continues to disagree with Washington on everything except the nuclear deal, which is Iran, is is qualified now to share the Middle East with us when we've been, a great friend of the United States over the long run and continue to support all of Washington's major policy goals in the region. I think they don't get the logic of that.
Well, let
And
me jump
I
in with
also
something here,
struggle.
Hussein. Let me jump in with this. Do you think Barack
Yeah.
Obama demonstrated with that a certain dislike of Arabs?
I don't know. I mean, he doesn't seem to like the Saudi elite. Let's put it that way. I don't know. I wouldn't go any further than that. I would say this: he has a double standard regarding Arab societies and Iran, whereby his criticisms, which are justifiable, of Arab countries as autocratic, undemocratic, and repressive of women, patriarchal, are all legitimate. But he gives Iran a pass on that. I mean, he kind of criticizes the Gulf Arab states on those grounds, fine, but he then talks about Iran as if it were not radically undemocratic, it were not patriarchal, it were not misogynistic, and all of those things at least as much. It is. So he's got, I wouldn't say necessarily dislikes Arabs as much as he seems to have a weird blind spot for Iran's obvious and very, very similar, strikingly similar problems on questions of democracy, of gender, of terrorism, of religious extremism and fanaticism.
Well, we can certainly say this.
Is the anti-Americanism. What's missing is the fact that they oppose the United States, and that he mentions it, but he doesn't seem to really have internalized it in any serious.
I hear you, but he does, Christian, let me go to you on this. He certainly does say this. He rails in the article against, quote, the obdurate power of tribalism. And I wonder whether, in your view, that's one of the reasons why he seems to have very little patience for the challenges that the Middle East presents right now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous quote by an Arab historian that the great power shouldn't get involved in the politics of the small tribes of the Middle East. And so I think there's an inherent sort of apprehension about what it is that the Americans can actually achieve. I mean, I lived in Kuwait for 5 years. I know what sort of the antagonism to anything and everything American is like in that particular region. And that the memories in the Middle East are long, and they are much longer than we appreciate, for instance, that we appreciate in the West. And the Palestinians often likes to joke that the West has the watches, but we have the time. And so there are long memories. People, I think, have long-standing antagonisms, and that these are not things that can be solved in 5 or 10 years. But I think what we also learn is, and this sort of is history that continuously repeats itself, that if Americans disengage from the Middle East, it's never a good story and a good outcome, and that it does require American engagement. But the president has made it clear it's going to be leading from behind, is sort of the military doctrine that people refer to, and that the Middle East has become less important in terms of strategic importance with regards to oil. And there's a sense of that folks in the Middle East have to sort out their destiny, and that ultimately this is probably more Europe's backyard than the Americans' backyard. And so it's time for countries to step up, to grow up, to sort out some of their differences. And I think with regards to the remarks of autocrats, I mean, the article points out that the challenge, I mean, this is Thomas Friedman's remark, that the challenge here is that here are kleptocrats in many of these countries that have basically deceived and distracted their populations with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades, while they themselves have grossly enriched themselves. And that this is bound to lead to a lot of political, economic, cultural, and social grievances that will take significant amounts of time to sort out.
Heather, let me get you on Iran. And I guess the thing that was particularly striking about the article was the fact that the president did say, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, it's my name on this. He certainly took ownership of the deal that, the very controversial deal he just put together. And I wonder what you think that says about the so-called Obama Doctrine, that he's put his name so clearly on this part of the world.
Well, the thing that the piece really conveys throughout, and not just at the point that you highlighted, is how confident Obama is that he's made the right choices in these areas. And something that I think hasn't been focused on much is the extraordinariness of the interviewer, Jeffrey Goldberg, being someone who was quite critical of the Iran deal and has pushed quite hard for the administration to take a rather different approach on the Middle East. And for Obama to have as candid, bordering on over-candid, a conversation with him, I think really conveys, and was intended to convey, a depth of confidence on those issues. I want to say one other thing about Iran and about the Iran-Saudi Arabia question, which is that in some ways, we see this interview as tying off the Obama who came to the White House saying he would make a deal with Iran, saying that he wasn't afraid to talk to our enemies, and who went ahead and did the deal with Iran, also the deal with Cuba, also overseeing a change of government in Burma. So on the one hand, this is the sort of the triumph of that Obama, right? And at the same time, you can read his remarks as very responsive to the dynamics currently going on in American politics and the dynamics that his successors will face. And one of those is that particularly in his own party, it simply isn't true anymore that Americans see the Saudis as an ally. And, Hussein, much of what you said is just unrecognizable to voters and elites, again, more on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. But I think there's
also uncontestably true, though. I mean, it's also uncontestably true.
But it depends what you think. Again, it depends what you think the long-term strategic goals in the region are. And what I think Obama's pointing to, and that observers would be remiss not to notice, is that a construct of the world in which it's clear that the Saudis are our friends and the Iranians are not. I mean, throw out the notion of friends, and that will, I think, help you have a more realistic policy discussion. But that's not the reflexive position of decision makers in America anymore, and that's really worth picking up from this piece.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. It's not the reflexive understanding anymore, but it's a fact. I mean, of course, we can go and interrogate what the long-term strategic goals of the United States are, but they are in writing. There are a series of documents that lay them out, and we can say that that's all nonsense or that needs to be redefined or whatever. Well, then we need to redefine them, and then we can revisit it. But we do know what our long-term strategic goals are, and the Saudis are supportive of almost all of them.
Well, Hussein, tell me this.
Tactically, we disagree on how to approach them. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things Obama returned to several times in the piece is he's got no time for free riders, and he really is tired of the fact that America seems to diplomatically and militarily be responsible for all the heavy lifting, and he wants some other countries to help pick up the pace. Well, apparently a former Saudi ambassador to the U.S. responded publicly to that. What did that person have to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, Prince Turki had an open letter to President Obama in which he said we're not free riders at all, and he listed all the things that Saudi Arabia has done, to bolster the alliance with the United States. Some of it really overly defensive in a kind of whiny sort of way about how much money the Saudis have spent sending their students to the United States at vast expense, but some of it very serious. And one of the things that he mentions that I think would have been better emphasized even more and needs to be brought up and really interrogated is that the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others are starting to be more proactive in their own defense, and that this is not simply a good thing for the United States, it's a complicated thing. So that, for example, you see them operating in Yemen in a war that Washington publicly supports but privately has real doubts about, or the different roles in Syria and elsewhere. Where the Gulf states are starting to act on their own. And so from the point of view of burden sharing, that's a good thing. And it's embraced by Washington, and it seems to respond to this demand of, okay, step up and do more. And they're saying, sure, well, we are. Now help us. But from the point of view of coordination and cooperation, it's not such a good thing. The United States has been a little bit annoyed by some of the ways in which this has played itself out in practice because of the extent to which Washington is not dictating anymore what the Saudi policy is. And
let me get Christian on
they
this.
do what they want. So it's a mixed bag.
Christian, you find yourself in Germany right now, and I want to quote a German journalist to you, Joseph Joffe, editor of Die Zeit, who wrote that Obama, quote, misunderstands what it means to be the world's number one, that Mr. Big is always going to have to pay more. Do you agree that's the way it should be?
Well, I think people refer to this free riding. In my own writings, I've referred to this as easy riding. But there's also, as we see, for instance, with regards to Yemen, as was just alluded to, there's people who are perhaps, in Americans' view, perhaps a little bit too proactive. The Americans have real apprehensions about, and have shown those apprehensions in terms of the delivery of weaponry to the Saudis or the UAE in terms of not helping them plan their amphibious offensive in Aden. And I think what Joseph Joffe is getting at, that But Obama is, I think, by heart very much a realist, and we see this sort of in the drone strategy. But he can't fully act on that realism because he's constrained, as Heather has pointed out, by I think the isolationist drift and tendency within sort of the general American public opinion. And while people have criticized Obama, I think, for his foreign policy decisions in the Middle East, his withdrawal from Iraq, his dithering on Syria, I do think President Obama has had a very good pulse on what American public opinion, the sort of the broad majority, is prepared to tolerate, and that America is economically, politically, morally exhausted after the adventures in Afghanistan and after the adventures in Iraq. And so while perhaps the president might have been prepared to do more, I think he realizes that politics is the art of the possible, and that he's, I think, profoundly pragmatic when it comes to what he is indeed prepared to provide, whether it is intelligence, weapons, or actual kinetic effect.
Well, Heather, it's very interesting because certainly Barack Obama doesn't like free riders, but there's another person who's topping the public opinion surveys these days who doesn't like free riders anymore, and his name is Donald Trump. They seem to agree on this. What does that say about the state of play of American politics today?
Look, for decades, there's been nothing that can unite Democratic and Republican foreign policy professionals more than to get together and complain about allies not doing their fair share. So I want to be clear that unlike some of the other things that Trump has had to say, this is a long-standing complaint of American policy leaders. You saw it previously aired most publicly by former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, not usually known as a firebrand, who you may remember, Christian will certainly remember, had something of a farewell tour going around and telling unpleasant truths to his European colleagues. So, in some ways, I think what this reflects is foreign policy catching up to the rest of our public discourse, where we say crass things in public rather than leaving them unsaid. And Trump, an interesting side note, back in the 80s, actually, Trump was taking out full-page ads in the New York Times complaining about our Saudi and Japanese allies when Ronald Reagan was president. So, this is Obama's tapping into, perhaps even more than he realizes, frankly, a very long-standing strain or strand of American foreign policy. And I think, interestingly, we've now, what you're seeing in the political debate is that we've moved a little bit past the kind of exhaustion that Christian was talking about, which I think was a fair description of our political culture for a few years. But post-ISIS, post-Russia in Ukraine, post-China in the South China Sea, you're starting to see, I think, a return to a desire for an American policy that feels more muscular, a desire for feeling that actions are being taken to make Americans safer, with still a profound skepticism about sort of which actions will actually work. There was this wonderful poll a year and a half ago of Americans saying they figured we would eventually put ground troops into the fight against ISIS, but they didn't believe it would work. So you have this kind of sullen assertiveness, maybe I'd call it, in the American public right now.
Well, Hussein, let me take you to Jordan, where King Abdullah II is quoted as having said, "I think I believe in American power more than Barack Obama does." What did you take from that comment?
No, I think that's right. Well, I think from an Arab point of view, which Abdullah is expressing rather well, there is and it's sort of paradoxical given the resentment of the United States that was referred to earlier, which is historically true in the Middle East, but there's really a sense that there is a kind of vacuum of American leadership. And I was just talking a couple of hours ago with a major Arab ambassador in Washington, and he was talking about policy drift and saying on all these issues, this issue, that issue, the other issue, we're not clear what exactly American policy is. We don't really know what the United States wants and where it's going. And he's absolutely sincere about this as a very thoughtful, intelligent, sophisticated man. And he's, is genuinely perplexed by what American policy is on some very key issues and trends in the Middle East. That's, I think, what King Abdullah of Jordan is talking about as well. And So that, for example, when President Obama talks to Jeffrey Goldberg and is not only confident, but almost hubristic, almost arrogant in saying, I've been right, I'm right all along, etc. And on Syria, when I walked away from the red line, I did the right thing and I wouldn't get involved. I've done almost nothing in Syria, and that's a good thing. And we look at the outcome of the policy, maybe not from the point of view of the United States, but overall, you've got 500,000 dead Syrians and a quarter of the Syrian population displaced in 5 years. The country in flames, the whole region, rocked. There's just no way you can look at the outcome of this policy and say, wow, what a great success. This is just brilliant. You've handled this beautifully, Mr. President. I just don't think anyone can say that. Or if you remember something people have forgotten from the first term, the way the president mangled Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations when he demanded a settlement freeze from the Israelis, and they told him no, and he said, oh, okay, never mind then, and dropped the issue, and then the whole system has never recovered.
We're not going to spend the whole show worrying about that.
Well,
but the
fair.
fact is, he said we want the settlements, and Israel said no, and that was the end of the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama.
It was also the end of the peace process. That's my point.
Well,
It was such a blow to the peace process that hasn't recovered, and it was Obama's own miscalculation. He made a demand. The Israelis told him to get lost, and he just said, well, okay, and shrugged and moved on. It was a disastrous
Looking forward.
blow.
Christian, looking forward, let me try this with you. We've already established the fact that Obama doesn't like the free riders. We've established the fact that Donald Trump doesn't like him any better. Heather very correctly pointed out that there's a long history of this kind of attitude in American political history. But there is somebody who was part of the Obama administration who's expressed a lot more muscular views on foreign policy, and that's the person who looks sure to be leading the Democrats into the next presidential election. I'm wondering whether you think Hillary Clinton will continue, if and when she's president, to express a kind of U.S., you are the world sheriff, and we're going to continue to be that when I'm president.
I have a sense that the way to sum this up, perhaps, in terms of potential continuity from Obama is that Thomas Frieden makes this point that there's sort of in a globalized world, there's two types of countries. There's the countries who want to be powerful and the countries who want to be prosperous. And I think the divide that we see also that I think, for instance, Heather has alluded to in Washington is that traditionally it's all about the establishment that wants America to be powerful. But where Obama has shifted America to is that what matters is that America is prosperous. And this is not a zero-sum game, but that prosperity will require some power projection, but it doesn't require the sort of overextension in which America has been engaged in at some points in the past, and a realization that this very extensive spending on sort of military prowess is perhaps not necessary and possibly even counterproductive to some other objectives that America has for its own sort of society. And I'm concerned, and I think, for instance, that under Clinton, the preoccupation may quite well be with sort of a continuation of looking to others to do a lot more when it comes to the sort of heavy lifting that is required. And we see sort of coordination and collective action problems among the Europeans. And we see folks in the Middle East not sort of playing entirely by the playbook in Washington. And I think a willingness to perhaps sit back, but also not discount the relationship. I mean, John Kerry, people have said, is the best friend that Germany has ever had in a foreign minister. And there's a lot of concern that under President Clinton, that relationship with Europe in general and with Germany in particular may not be as warm. And so it means that European interests will be even less represented, rest sort of coalesce with American interests. And it means that more is going to be expected from the Europeans, even more than has been the case under the Obama administration.
Heather, I'm down to my last 2 minutes, and I want to, if you're going to forgive me here, I want to give you the last 2 minutes, Heather, but I want you to speak to this, if you would, which is, I guess so many people have been struck by the candor that President Obama expressed in that Atlantic article. And, whether you want to describe it as arrogance or hubris or whatever, it surely was a guy who felt very comfortable and assured of his decisions. And I wonder whether you think it was wise for him to have said as much as he did while he still holds the office.
It's certainly different from anything we've seen from a sitting president before, and it'll be interesting. I have to say, as I said, I think it represents the foreign affairs public discussion moving into the sector where we've seen other kinds of politics. And I know I'm not supposed to say this on TV, but I'm not really sure how history is going to judge that. One thing I should say I am quite sure of Christian, you're both wrong and right about some of what we will see from a President Clinton, which is to say that she personally and the people she's surrounded with are longtime friends of Europe and our allies and have relationships with all of those countries going back decades. So I think in terms of tone, the anxiety is completely misplaced, and you'll see very strong relationships and real efforts to rebuild those relationships where you see some anxiety now, as Hussein mentioned. Now, the other reality is that the U.S. has very divided politics and has a real contingent of budget hawks that feel very strong pressures, and has a public that feels like it hasn't shared in the economic recovery, which has been, the key underlying theme of our primaries. So, you're going to see a President Clinton. I think this would have also been true, by the way, if you'd had a President Rubio or a President Kasich, who wants to change the tone, but is going to face some of the same pressures, the same secular pressures that led President Obama to ask our allies and friends to do more. So that duality is just the reality of American power for the foreseeable future.
I think the tension in the Middle East might continue, by the way.
Well,
even if it's less
that you can always set your watch to, I'm afraid, Hussein.
I mean between Washington and the Arab capitals, yeah.
I notice, Heather, that President Trump didn't make your list, and that will have to be the subject of a future program that we do, because that's our time tonight. I do want to thank Hussein Ibish, the senior resident scholar with the Arab Gulf States Institute. I want to thank Heather Hurlbert from the New America organization, and Christian Leuprecht from RMC, who's over in Munich, Germany. Thanks so much to the three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. We've been very appreciative to have your time.
Anytime.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.